I'd like to welcome you to our webinar celebrating the 150th anniversary of the birth of Marconi. A few administrative points before we get started. First, the slides presented here are going to be posted. If you go to wirelessinnovation.org/webinars, you'll be able to find all the slides that we're using today. We're also recording the webinar, and you can find that at youtube.com/the Wireless Innovation Forum. If you have any questions at all about how you find these things, please, or anything else related to the webinar, please feel free to email me at lee.pucker@wirelessinnovation.org, and I am happy to assist you. For questions today, if you have a question for any of the panelists or the speakers, please use the questions window in your GoToWebinar interface. I will be moderating the questions and passing them on as appropriate as we go. And with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce co-host of this, Dr. Let me bring up the slides. There we go. Dr. Barry Sullivan. Barry is with the Marconi Society, and Barry, I'll let you introduce yourself further.
Sure. Thank you, Lee. Again, I'm Barry Sullivan. I'm Director of Program Development for the Marconi Society. And it's a pleasure to be a part of today's event and representing the Marconi Society. Just a few words about the Society and our mission. The Marconi Society encourages and celebrates innovators who push the technical, creative, and entrepreneurial boundaries of information and communications technologies for the benefit of humanity. We pursue this goal through prestigious awards, events, and programs. Throughout its history, the Society has been dedicated to recognizing and promoting those that contribute significant advancements in communications and information technology. Several years ago, the Marconi Society expanded its mission to include building digitally inclusive communities through the innovators that we celebrate. As you may have assumed, the Society is named in honor of the visionary scientist Guglielmo Marconi, whose birth date we're celebrating today. And the organization was founded by his daughter, Giulia Marconi Braga, in 1974. So as we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of Marconi's birth, the Society is also celebrating 50 years of its existence as well. Now, since its establishment in 1974, the Marconi Society has celebrated groundbreaking achievements in connectivity and communication. The Society administers various programs, including the Marconi Prize, the Paul Baring Young Scholars Award, supporting young researchers, along with digital inclusion training and the National Broadband Mapping Coalition to help close the digital divide. Through these programs, the Marconi Society fosters innovation, inspires future generations, and promotes positive social impact globally. It's now my pleasure to turn the podium over to Andrew Clegg, the Chief Technical Officer of the WInnForum. Andy?
Thanks, Barry. Thanks, Lee. I'm not going to say too much at this point. You'll be hearing from me on and off during the course of today's event. We have some very interesting material lined up for everybody today. So in order to keep ourselves on time, actually, I'm going to pass it back over to Barry. And Barry, I'd be glad if you could introduce our first couple of topic matters today. Barry, are you there?
Okay. I was trying to be a good panelist and muting myself. So thank you, Andy. I'm back now.
Sure.
Yes, it's now my pleasure to introduce some pre-recorded remarks from Giulia Fortunato. Giulia is the president of Fondazione Guglielmo Marconi, the Marconi Foundation in Bologna, Italy. And We can play those remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased and honored to join the Wireless Innovation Forum in celebrating the 150th anniversary of the birth of Guglielmo Marconi. As president of the Guglielmo Marconi Foundation and as president of the National Committee for the celebration of the 150th anniversary, both institutions by the Italian Ministry of Culture. The Guglielmo Marconi Foundation is a non-profit entity. It has been established in 1938, just a year after the death of our Nobel Prize winner. Our foundation has its headquarters at Villa Grifone. It's a national monument located up on the beautiful hills of Bologna. It was at this location where the young Marconi, at 21 years of age, launched the transmission of the first wireless signal. This year, we celebrate the extraordinary genius of a man who deeply impacted daily life during his time. We commemorate Marconi's legacy with a rich program of activities, both in Italy and abroad. It's essential to recognize how Marconi's innovation continue to shape our lives through telecommunications and infrastructures, influencing us on a daily basis. So let us come together to celebrate the legacy of the Lord of Wireless.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Now I have the privilege to introduce another video. This is a demonstration of Marconi's original experiment. And this comes to us from the Marconi Museum. It'll be narrated by Barbara Bellotti, the Marconi Museum curator, and featuring Giovanni Sandri, who is the lab tutor.
Hello from Villa Grifone, the house where Guglielmo Marconi grew up. He was born in the center of Bologna in 1874, but he grew up mainly here, and it was in the attic of the villa that he set up his first lab as a very young kid interested in electricity. Here he became determined to become an inventor, and here, when he was 20 in 1894, he had a fundamental intuition, using electromagnetic waves for wireless communication. He built a transmitter and a receiver, and he started to test his wireless telegraphy system inside the villa, but all the most important experiments here were carried outside, where he carried out his most important experiments, overcoming a natural obstacle, the famous Celestini Hill here in Sasso Marconi, just in front of the window of his lab. And those experiments carried out in 1895 by 21-year-old Marconi marked the beginning of radio communication. And now you will see how Marconi's first system of wireless telegraphy worked, and with the help of Giovanni Sandri, that will behave as if he were young Marconi today, you will see how his first transmitter was made, and together with his first receiver. So you will see the first system of wireless telegraphy working.
So you are looking at a replica of the first transmitting station. It's composed by the Morse key, batteries, Runcorf coil, oscillator, and the great invention of Marconi, antenna and ground. The main component of the transmitter is the oscillator, which has the job of create the waves. But only thanks to antenna and ground, it's possible to reach longer distance. Now we are looking at the first Marconi's receiver. The main component of this receiver is the coherer, that is a glass tube with metal powder inside of it. Usually, this component doesn't allow the current flow, but if the metal powder inside of the glass tube gets hit by a radio wave, it allows the current flow. Marconi improved this invention by changing the powder inside of the coherer and also added a bell. Thanks to the bell, it's possible to listen to the radio waves. Let's see how it works. When Marconi presented his invention in London, he didn't use the bell, he used the Morse printer. In this way, the public could see what he was writing in Morse code.
Fin dal 1895, all'inizio cioè dei miei primi esperimenti, io ebbi la forte intuizione, direi quasi la visione chiara e sicura, che le trasmissioni radiotelegrafiche sarebbero state possibili attraverso le più grandi distanze. Da quel giorno la scienza delle radiocomunicazioni ha fatto passi da gigante ed offre oggi all'umanità il più potente ed universale mezzo di rapida comunicazione a distanza che il mondo abbia mai conosciuto. Guglielmo Marconi.
Well, for those of us who work in modern telecommunications, fascinating to see how it all began. Andy, back to you.
Great, thanks, Barry. Yeah, interesting demonstration. Love to see Morse code printed out like that. Makes it easier to copy, but very interesting. And thank you to the Marconi Museum for providing that. So our next video, which also had to be pre-recorded, is with Marc Raboy, who has written a definitive biography on Marconi, and he agreed to do an interview with us for this special event. Both Marc and Giulia, who you heard from earlier, are of course very busy today with activities at Villa Grifoni outside of Bologna, where they have tremendous set of activities planned for today, because today is the actual birthday of anniversary of the birth date of Marconi. But I interviewed Marc a couple of weeks ago, and so we have a lot of interesting remarks from Marc with regard to sort of the historic nature of Marconi. And by the way, we did not have time to present the full interview for today's webinar. There were a couple of segments in addition that we weren't able to add here. He talked a little bit about the competition between Marconi and some of his other competitors at the time, and why it was that Marconi ended up on top out of that sort of competition back in the day, which is an interesting discussion. And we also discussed sort of the comparison of how wireless transmission across the water, across the ocean, compared economically to what they had been using up to that time, and that was undersea cables, which were very expensive to lay and operate. So if you'd like to see the entire interview with Marc, that is posted, that will be or is posted on our website, but we've got the rest of the interview today. And Stephanie, if you want to roll that, let's go with that. Okay, hi all. We're fortunate to have with us Emeritus Professor Marc Raboy from McGill University. Professor Raboy has written a definitive biography of Marconi. I happen to have a copy of it here. Marconi, the man who networked the world. He's here to provide some historical context and tidbits about Marconi's life and work. I read Marc's book last year, and I really encourage anyone with an interest in Marconi specifically or the historical development of wireless technology in general to consider reading it. Besides being meticulously researched, the book also benefits from Marc's impressive writing skills. So it's a great read. Professor Raboy, thanks for joining us today. I know you have a busy schedule with the approach of Marconi's 150th, so thank you for taking time to participate in this celebration with the Wireless Innovation Forum and the Marconi Society.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Okay, so let's start with a few questions here. So we're here to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Marconi's birth back in 1874. Can you give us a little insight into Marconi's roots and his early life?
Well, Marconi was born in Italy, in Bologna, and he spent most of the first few years of his life in Italy. But one thing that is not always realized by people is that his mother was British. His mother was Irish Protestant, actually Scottish roots. She was, in fact, from the Jameson whiskey family, and that became an important factor in the development of Marconi's business career, his company, and so on. We'll get to that later. But so Marconi's on his father's side, they were fairly, what we might call today, not quite nouveau riche, petite bourgeoisie, so on. Marconi's paternal grandfather apparently was the first member of the family to actually read and write, and he prospered in business, and at the level of Marconi's father and his siblings were doing very well in Italy in the 1870s, which it was shortly after unification and so forth. Marconi's mother was sent to Ireland by her parents to study music, and she met and fell in love with this gentleman Marconi, who actually was a young widower with a son. They married. He was quite a bit older. They had one son, Alfonso, and then Guglielmo came along a bit later. So they lived at a pretty substantial estate outside Bologna, Villa Grifoni, in fact, which is now the headquarters of the Marconi Foundation, and where the main celebrations of the anniversary are taking place. He grew up there, and he was an indifferent student as a child and a young adolescent, but his parents recognized that he had certain talents and certain proficiencies. He was particularly interested in sciences and in tinkering with all sorts of stuff at the time, and they happened to have a neighbor who was a professor of physics at the University of Bologna, Augusto Righi, and he kind of took a liking to Marconi and gave him access to materials at the university and so on, allowed him to attend lectures. I'm getting slightly ahead now. I mean, that's Marconi as let's say an 18-year-old. Even earlier, he was tutored rather than attending regular school, and his tutors focused on math and physics, particularly physics. And as I said, he liked tinkering with stuff, and since he spoke English, having had two mother tongues, English and Italian, he was able as a teenager to read scientific literature of the day. So he read about the fantastic discovery of airwaves by Heinrich Hertz in the mid 1880s, and as many others in different parts of the world, people with more substantial track records than Marconi were already beginning to do. He began tinkering with this in the attic of his parents' house, and basically for a number of reasons. Marconi was fascinated with the idea of communication, and particularly with the idea of mobile communication. As a boy, he liked going out on the water. He liked going out at sea. At one point, the family lived in the port of Livorno, and he would go out and sail, and feel, wouldn't it be wonderful if I could actually be in touch with with people on land while I'm doing this, and that was sort of the idea that began to formulate in his mind. And the dominant technology of the time was the wired telegraph. And Marconi said to himself, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just get rid of the wires and do what the telegraph does, which is basically Morse code communication. And he began tinkering with this at home in the villa. And actually, his father was a bit exasperated about this, saying, is this kid ever going to amount to anything? His mother was very protective and supportive of what he was doing. And in the fall of 1894, or some would say 1895, and there is some controversy about this, and it's very, very difficult to pin down the actual date. But let's say in 94 or 95, he actually succeeded in sending a signal across a large room on the upper floor of the family villa by Morse code telegraph, emitting a spark, basically. This came to be known eventually as spark gap telegraphy. It's somewhat later. Having done that, he was a very tenacious lad, and he said to himself, and this is a lot of this was going on in kind of internal dialogue. He said to himself, if I can send a signal across a room, why can't I send it farther? And he started trying to do this. And one of the famous experiments he did at one point is he had his brother and one or two of the employees of the estate go over the hill to a neighboring hillside, and and he tried to send this signal again. And he said, when you get the signal, fire a gun. Right, and sure enough, well, this is the legend anyway. That this is what happened. And again, he said, well, okay, I just need to keep tinkering with this and perfecting it, and I'll be able to do longer and longer, send messages over longer and longer distances. And basically, that's what he did for the rest of his life. I mean, he just kept developing this one idea that he had about eventually global, worldwide, mobile, long distance communication.
Yeah, I'm struck from your book. You spend a lot of the book talking about Marconi's attempts to transmit over and receive over longer and longer distances, while also attracting backers and customers and applications. And in fact, it seems like, and also, of course, battling patents and all sorts of other things, but it seems like it's just a constant challenge to communicate farther and build up a customer base. Can you sort of, you obviously have all of the details, but can you talk a little bit about, how it all evolved, how the technology evolved, but also how his business and his empire evolved at the same time?
Sure. Well, by the time he was, Marconi was doing what I just described a moment ago, his family realized that there was something to this. There was something going on here. I mean, we're talking now about the 1890s. There are all kinds of changes in technology taking place in other spheres of activity, but they also had the feeling that there wasn't much that they would be able to do in Italy with this, because there wasn't that kind of entrepreneurial, industrial development culture, if you like. And the family decided that Marconi's mother would take him to England, where she had business connections. I mean, a nephew of Marconi's mother, first cousin of Marconi, a man by the name of Henry Jameson Davis, was worked in the city of London, and he was a very entrepreneurial figure. And you know, when Annie Jameson and Marconi arrived in London in 1896, he said, "Look, you know, we have to create a company and exploit this." And Marconi himself, I mean, he was only 22 years old, and he was reluctant to do this. He wasn't particularly interested in getting into business. He was just interested in getting the resources and support necessary to work on his system, as he called it. And one of the people who got wind of what Marconi was doing was the chief engineer of the British Post Office at the time, a man by the name of William Preece. And he was trying to find ways to extend communication capacity for the British Empire, basically. And one of the things that he was interested in was communicating across water, communicating without wires. And he had actually himself been working on some kind of experimental processes for this, not using the airwaves, but by induction electricity and so on. And Preece, he welcomed Marconi. Marconi demonstrated his apparatus to Preece, and Preece was willing to give Marconi support as technical assistance and equipment and so on. But obviously, he wanted Marconi to come and work for the post office. And Marconi's first inclination was to do this, but he was convinced by his cousin that it was in his interests and the interests of the family that they create a company. Now, before they created the company, they arranged to patent Marconi's system, which was initially patented as improvements in telegraphy. I mean, that's sort of the way they couched it. Having created a patent and having created the company, Marconi sold the patent to the company in exchange for a controlling interest of shares, and that is how that got started. I mean, the company had one asset, Marconi's patent, and they proceeded to patent it in every country in the world where it was possible to patent something. So before anyone else realized what was going on, this embryonic Marconi company actually had a global monopoly on wireless communication using the radio spectrum. And within 5 years, it was a thing. It was a big thing. So that's basically how it got started. Marconi basically for the next 30 years, he went back to Italy on visits, but he was essentially based in the UK, traveled constantly. As I mentioned earlier, he loved being at sea. And eventually, he acquired a Navy surplus ship, which he refigured into a yacht. And Marconi had no fixed address on land for many years. He lived basically on the yacht. When he had to be in London or elsewhere, he would stay in a hotel, and he had a lab on the yacht. So this was his principal research location, as well as his home for many years.
So very interesting. I presume that the biggest feat that Marconi achieved, at least publicity-wise, was his first transatlantic communication back in 1901 from Poldhu in southern England, which I've got a little picture there to my right here, to off to Newfoundland. Can you sort of set the stage for him finally being able to demonstrate transatlantic communications, and what the comparative economics were at that time of doing a wireless station to bridge the Atlantic compared to laying a transatlantic cable or something?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I mean, Marconi, once he got started, he kept working on increasing the distance that he was able to communicate, increasing the power, and increasing the effectiveness of the signals and messages that he was able to send. So let's say in the years 1898, 1899, 1900, over time, he was able to, I mean, one of the great publicity events was when he was able to get across the English Channel. I mean, that was very important. I mean, that, and even before that, I mean, crossing water, I mean, the first crossing of water was the Bristol Channel between England and Wales. I mean, that was, and every one of these events generated a tremendous amount of publicity. I mean, by 1900, Marconi was a media rock star. I mean, the media loved him, and he was very good at handling the press. And so there was a lot of interest in whatever he was doing. There was always a lot of speculation in what he might be doing, and and people, press people were following him everywhere, and so on. So. Early in 1901, he managed to send across a distance of a couple of 100 miles between 2 points. I mean, still in the British Isles. Excuse me. And he began working on trying to increase the distance with the goal of getting across the Atlantic. At the same time that he was doing this, Nikola Tesla in the US began saying, I'm about to send a signal across the Atlantic. And the Marconi company people said, look, you've got to do this before Tesla. I mean, this is crucial. And so this became the next big thing that he was working on. And he was working on this through 1901. And initially the idea was he located a point on Cape Cod in the U.S. where the company decided, they bought a piece of land, and they decided to put up a receiving antenna, and this is what they were intending to do, to send a signal from Poldhu in England to Cape Cod in Massachusetts. And then there was a terrible storm, and the Massachusetts tower fell down, and they said, we can't wait. We can't rebuild this. It's too risky. What are we going to do? They looked at the map and they said, well, the closest point to England in North America is the east coast of Newfoundland. Newfoundland. All right, well, let's go to Newfoundland. So Marconi and a couple of assistants and a crate load of equipment got on a ship, went to Newfoundland, and they concocted some story to tell the press, because of course Marconi at that point could not get on a ship without it attracting media attention. So they told they told the press that he was trying to that he was setting up a shore station on Newfoundland for communicating with ships as they passed by 50 miles away or whatever. And okay, that went over, but they didn't have time to put up an actual transmission reception tower, and they were afraid that it would blow down anyway. So they decided to work with a system of kites that had been perfected by the British Army in South Africa during the Boer War, and sure enough, I mean, it actually worked, and on December 10th or 12th, 1901, they were able to, they received the signal of the Morse code signal for the letter S, and that was it. Yeah.
So now we get to sort of an interesting sidebar here. Some of us, or many of us in the Wireless Innovation Forum and Marconi Society, have participated in the ITU process, gone to World Radio Communication conferences and things like that. But I'm not sure how many of us realize the central role that Marconi, or at least the existence of Marconi and his system, played in the very formation of these World Radio conferences. So can you say a few words about Marconi's role in the WRCs?
Yes, absolutely. And you'll have to be sure I say only a few words here, because this was actually the way I got interested in Marconi. Was for many years I was involved in the regulatory side of communication, first in Canada and then internationally. And in the late 90s, at one point, I was doing some research on the origins of telecommunication, international telecommunication regulation. And I kind of went back through the ITU process. And the further back one goes, the more one encounters Marconi and his company. Marconi, the man, and the Marconi company, to the point where when you get to the 1903 first international radio telegraphy conference, it's all about Marconi. That's all it is about, because there's nothing else going on. I mean, there is, the Germans have an upstart company called Telefunken, which is doing quite well locally in Germany, trying to operate internationally, but having absolutely no ability to get past Marconi's patent firewall. And the U.S., as I hinted to earlier, the U.S. is trying to develop its own wireless technology and get into the field. Other companies, France, Belgium, and so on, are as well. And the Germans, we're talking 1903, the German government decides that it doesn't want a British company to have a monopoly in wireless communication. And so they call this international conference, they get together the 6 or 8 leading powers of the world at that point to a conference in Berlin, and they put out the idea that it doesn't make any sense for one company to have the exclusive use of what they now recognize as a global common resource. I mean, they frame it this way. They say this is the they're not calling it the radio spectrum yet, but radio waves, the airwaves, whatever you want to call it. No, it can't be left in the hands of a single company. And they managed to get buy-in to that. I mean, and the only countries that are opposed to it are, you can guess who they are. I mean, the UK and Italy, because they have their own deals with Marconi and their own interest in promoting the Marconi company. But they're not, that those objections are not strong enough. They can't prevail. And it actually takes until 1906 in a second convention before they're actually able to set up what has now become the international regulatory framework for this type of communication. And as I mentioned, it started strictly with the sole purpose of breaking the Marconi monopoly.
And a lot of the politics of the radio conferences haven't changed much from that back in 1903. So very interesting. So, speaking of interesting and fascinating, I found the most interesting quote in your book from Marconi, and it goes back to 1919. In fact, I've used this in some talks since reading it. Let me read it here. It gives an idea of how much of a visionary that Marconi was. He wrote, "The popular anticipation of pocket wireless telephones, by means of which a passenger flying in an airplane over France or Italy might, quote, ring up a friend walking about the streets of London with a receiver in his pocket, cannot be said to have been as yet practically realized, but there is nothing inconceivable or even impractical about such an achievement, and the progress of wireless telephony seems to be pointing in that direction. So, Marconi wrote that in 1919. That was more than 50 years before Marty Cooper, who we've also interviewed through the WInnForum, placed the very first cell phone call, and maybe 75 years before cell phones became practical. So it seems like Marconi just was an incredible visionary with regard to wireless technology.
Absolutely. As I think I've mentioned, I mean, Marconi, he didn't see any limit to this. I mean, he kept imagining eventual new uses and so on. And I mean, the quote you've picked out is interesting because it was actually realized. I mean, one could, if you wanted to play devil's advocate, you could probably find other quotes about where he's talking about something that, well, no, this is just not going to work. I mean, towards the end of his life, he was talking about something he called a death ray, which he was developing, which was, I wrote in my book, it was really like a taser. But he certainly was a visionary for the possibilities of communication, and I think that's really mainly what he deserves to be recognized for. I mean, he was the first to develop a practical system for wireless communication, but he also saw the possibilities. And and one can mention other examples. I mean, and there are quite a few, I think, in the book about when broadcast radio appeared, for instance. He thought that some of the initial uses of it were a bit frivolous. The idea of one-way communication, from a single station to many receivers. Well, in his mind, it was more important to think about wireless as two-way communication between point to point rather than point to mass, and so on. And I mean, this was that didn't prevail in the days of the, let's say, in the early days of radio and television, but we're back to it now in many respects with the way the way we use our cell phones and other forms of 21st century communication. I mean, I think it's something that I wrote at one point in the book, and I think it's maybe a bit of a stretch, but anyway, I wrote it there. I mean, one way of describing Marconi could be to say the 20th century didn't exist. I mean, Marconi leapfrogged from the 19th century to the 21st century with his the system that he developed, and of course, he monetized it, he commercialized it. In his mind, having a company was a way of keeping his own freedom to work the way he wanted to, on whatever he wanted to at any point in time, and often to the exasperation of his managers and shareholders. But he didn't let that bother him. It gave him the resources to pursue his vision without having to be accountable to anybody, really.
Yep. So your book is very detailed, very thorough. It's impossible to even pretend we can summarize all of the interesting material in the book in an interview of almost any length. But despite that, or maybe because of that, is there anything else you would like to add that you think would be of interest to our audience about Marconi?
Yeah. Well, I'd say just to close off. I mean, I mentioned earlier at one point the way he was always close to political power and how important that was to him. But that's also, I think, if we stand back and look at Marconi and think about what he was doing, I think it's important to realize he made, aside from the opportunities that his company gave him, his connections. He was very political in the sense of making, not ideological, but political in the sense of making the alliances that he made. And something that has not been very widely explored is his relationship with Mussolini the last 10 years of his life. I mean, he went back to Italy in 1927. Marconi was much better known worldwide than Mussolini. Mussolini said, "Oh, this great Italian's coming back. I'm going to make him head of the Italian Academy. I'm going to make him head of the National Research Council, and so on and so forth." And Marconi said, "Oh, okay, I'm going to work with this regime." It was not always a happy relationship, but and Marconi died in 1937. We don't know how it would have turned out. But the other thing is that he was also, towards the end of his life, he was beginning to look self-critically at what he had done. At one point he said, I don't know, was this a good thing or a bad thing, what I've worked on? A lot like Oppenheimer, let's say. I mean, there's some, parallels being made there. Now that that story has come up. So,
yeah, fascinating. We really appreciate it, Marc. Thanks for the historical input. So we also understand on Marconi's actual birthday on April 25th, you'll be at the Villa Grifoni when this interview airs. You will be there celebrating the 150th anniversary. And you'll also be celebrating the release of the Italian edition of your book. So congratulations on both of those. And thanks again so much for providing your historical input. Very fascinating.
Thank you. It was really fun.
Well, Andy, that was fascinating insights into the life of Marconi. But now it's my privilege to introduce Dennis Roberson. Professor Roberson of the Illinois Institute of Technology also chairs the board of the Marconi Society. And Dennis, I understand that you're going to be sharing with us what you know about the evolution of wireless.
Yes. Thank you, Barry, and thank you, Andy, and in absentia, thank you, Marc. Marc is an amazing historian, and as you've already heard, has captured a tremendous insight into the complex life of Guglielmo Marconi. But it is the 150th, and I offer a couple of additional pictures here as we transition of Marconi in one of his stations, in fact, the Podon station that was referenced earlier, and the amazing antenna structures that existed at that time. So it's quite amazing what he did. Marc highlighted one of the key points that I will share through just a couple of slides, and I'll keep this relatively brief. But if we could move on to the next slide, what I'd like to talk about is what happened after Marconi. And again, Marc perfectly set this up. After Marconi came the whole regime of broadcast. And he wasn't very fond of broadcast, but it became a dominant form of the use of his invention of wireless. And in fact, those who led the effort around the broadcast declared themselves to be the true fathers of radio, that Marconi was the father of wireless telegraphy, and that was fine, but the real benefit of his work was now being realized with the broadcast to many. And it's interesting because the people there that included people like Lee DeForest and Edwin Armstrong and David Sarnoff in the US pushed this very hard and were quite successful in AM radio initially, shortwave as well. But that all led to broadcast television and the transition from AM to FM radio into other forms, color television and the like, as the dominant forms of the use of this new capability that wireless provided. But again, as Marc, I'll parrot what Marc said, Marconi perhaps had the last laugh on this one, because following all of the broadcast era, and it's still with us, of course, came the era of back to two-way communications and the wonderful quote that Andy provided. And that, of course, is how we most know wireless today, with the cell phones that we have in our pockets and all of the devices that are out there, Wi-Fi that allows us to connect, Bluetooth, Zigbee, ultra wideband that doesn't have so much play these days in the visibility, but is becoming increasingly important out there, of the Internet of Things, the transition to digital television and the like, many, many offshoots of this original work, and satellites into the mix as well. So what is critical that has happened from Marconi's time to enable this plethora of new everyday devices and capabilities and services that we all depend on? So if we could move to the next slide, critical to this, and was referenced in the 1903, 1906 ITU work, was the division of this scarce natural resource that you can't see, can't smell, can't touch, called electromagnetic spectrum. The allocation of the frequencies that God provided to us all, but providing them in a segmented way for the various services. And the chart that you see, for those of us in my world, is a very famous chart produced within the Department of Commerce by the National Telecommunications and Information Agency. And it shows how finely the spectrum is divided up to enable all of the services that we have today. So that was a critical ingredient. A second critical ingredient is on the next slide, or at least beginning to be introduced on the next slide, which is a repeat of the earlier slide, but now applying names, because there are human beings behind these things. Marty Cooper was already referenced with the cell phone. Advances in the cell phone by Irwin Jacobs and Andy Viterbi and Andrea Goldsmith and Paul Raj, and even in the digital television with Arun Netravalli. If we carry that forward to the next slide, I'll illuminate you on that vast number of people and characteristics that they produced. So this is a partial list, I would immediately add, of some of the technologies that have become very important to the telecommunications world and enabling the various services that we have, from adaptive modulation, artificial intelligence, cryptography, the information theory. Claude Shannon, the one who said, hey, you can send information in a way that is related directly to the amount of that frequency, that spectrum that you have, and the power that you have relative to the noise. The internet itself, with two titans, Bob Kahn and Vint Cerf, leading the charge, but numerous others there in the list. Communications and information technology industry leadership, with people like William Baker from Bell Labs and Gordon Moore at Intel and Bob Galvin at Motorola, and there could be many others there, to do the business side of this, so that it's not a lab curiosity, not a capability, but rather a useful technology that has the money engine to enable things to continue to be developed. Lasers and fiber optics, although we often don't think of them as part of the wireless world, the whole wireless world depends on that area. And it's often said that the wireless world only operates until the first opportunity to enter into the world of fiber optics and lasers and the wired world in general. Moving on to the next slide, I'll go even further with individual contributions that have been made, from MIMO antennas, multiple input, multiple output, that enable the spectrum to be more efficiently used, packet switching in general, relays and modems, with a number of critical individuals that have contributed there. Marty Cooper, I've already mentioned. GPS, a critical part of all this too, having the timing that actually enables a lot of the technologies to be produced. Printing and image processing, the ability to encode these things, satellite communications, all of this depends on semiconductors and circuit design capabilities, and some of the key individuals there are listed. Speech synthesis and recognition, and finally video compression. The people that I have shown and the dates, you're likely wondering by now, what are all those dates and who are all these people? These are people who have been recognized by the Marconi Society for their contributions over the years. There are certainly others, but this is a very good representation of the human side of telecommunications, complemented by the spectrum that has enabled us to have all these spectacular services. And I think although there's another slide, I think I'll stop at that point and move on to our next speaker. So thank you all for the opportunity to be here.
Dennis, thank you very much. Thank you for connecting the technology to the actual people, and bringing attention to the fact that Marconi Society has recognized these people as individuals who have contributed so much to wireless communications and other technology development. So great, thanks for that. And we have our final speaker today, is Dr. Joe Mitola. Joe is with ENSCO Mission Systems Group, but he's also widely credited with creating the concept of cognitive radio through his graduate work and work that he's done since then. So we brought Joe on to talk. We sort of did the history of Marconi. Dennis has sort of brought us up to date with the leaps that we've taken since Marconi's early technology development through to where we are today. And we're bringing Joe in to maybe say a few words, technical, philosophical, whatever strikes him with regard to what the future of radio and wireless might look like. So let me turn it over to you, Joe, and welcome.
Thanks, Andy. So that's my favorite situation. I was introduced by João da Silva, who was the director of wireless in the European community in the 1990s. And he's an Italian, I'm an Italian, Marconi's an Italian. And so I was nominated the godfather of software radio back then. And that was before getting into putting computational intelligence to the radio. 150 years ago, Stevens invented the US Patent Office, and patent number 586-193 right here, the original Marconi patent. So that's one of my prized possessions. I started young. We were chatting before this event, talking about crystal radios, and I got my first crystal radio when I was 10 or 11 years old, and it just had an earpiece and a dial for volume, and then a sweeper to determine the frequency. So AM is still with us, and to start radio, you can start young. United Nuclear will sell you an AM crystal radio, so that's pretty cool. And then add computing. So I was a Dusty Deck Fortran guy, learned to program Fortran in the 60s when we were still using punch decks, and from that you get cognitive radio. So computational intelligence plus wireless equals cognitive radio. What does the future look like? So a mentor of mine used to say, Joe, sometimes your only guide is a clean sheet of paper. If you're really not sure you want to where you want to go, and folks really don't know, then take out a clean sheet of paper and start there. And so on my clean sheet of paper, I wrote more artificial intelligence for more cognition. So as wireless has become more ubiquitous, the computing aspect, distributed computing, has become increasingly important. At the latest mobile MWC Barcelona, somebody said, we're just managing a huge distributed computer. Wireless has become a huge distributed computer. I think that's right. And so bringing more artificial intelligence into wireless will help the things that we have to become more effective and efficient, and to allow us to do more things such as more autonomous sharing of the radio spectrum in space and time. So in the early days, especially in aircraft, if the aircraft was heading away or sideways or maneuvering, you still wanted to be connected between air to air and air to ground, and therefore 360 degrees azimuth and elevation is really crucial. But as we have gone further, we've discovered that millimeter wave has a tremendous amount of capacity because of the increased availability of radio spectrum. And so if you think back to Dennis's slide there of the radio spectrum, there is not a lot up on the top side where you've got from 3 kilohertz to 30 kilohertz. There's not a lot of bandwidth there, but then as you go down into the 30 gigahertz range, there's lots of spectrum. So making these radios and the networks and the systems increasingly computationally intelligent about sharing the radio spectrum with each other, so that when radios bump into other radios, they can recognize it and automatically do things to mitigate. I think that's really the direction in which we're heading. I described that in my doctorate back in the late 90s. So artificial intelligence in radio was novel in the late 90s, and I got a doctorate for cognitive radio, but we still don't have it yet. And so there's a lot of room to move there. And then finally, I would say more autonomous and cross nodal validation of things so that we can have safer and more secure wireless. When we go wireless, we're opening ourselves up to mischief from cyber hackers and so forth. But as we come to the Internet of Things, especially around our homes, where our refrigerators are talking to our dishwashers, are talking to our vacuum cleaners, and to home security systems and so forth, the ability to cross-check and validate automatically, autonomously, seems to be an important direction for the security of wireless in the future. And so I think what we're going to do to get to the future of radio is to go back to our clean sheet of paper and then have our final few minutes be in a discussion of what the future of radio might look like. So thank you again for the opportunity to make some comments on this 150th anniversary of Guglielmo Marconi, my compatriot. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joe, and thanks for the modern Italian perspective. Very interesting. And so Barry and I are back on. We appreciate everybody who gave their comments today during this event. We do have a question from the audience, which I will throw to our esteemed panel, unless they would like me to answer it. But we have a question of whether we can discuss the significance of Marconi in maritime communications, specifically as it related to the Titanic disaster. Of course, Marc covers this a bit in his book, but if anybody would like to take that in detail, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll take a stab at it.
I'm happy to jump in on that one because I was a little surprised that Marc didn't talk about it, but it was one of the truly revolutionary points. The Titanic was equipped with a Marconi wireless telegraph capability, and it was in fact Marconi people who were the operators of this capability within the various ships. And the Titanic, of course, was the ship that could never sink, and it was on its maiden voyage and all of that likely the audience all knows about. But what I only recently learned was that the Titanic operator had a very large volume of information that was being transferred, mostly transferred ahead to the folks in the US. And such a volume, and there was another ship that was quite close by, whose name I have just lost. But in any event, there was a request for the operator of that ship to turn off his wireless capability so that there could be no interference. It was only a few miles away. The Carpathia was considerably further away and maintained its connection. When the Titanic hit the iceberg and sunk, then the ship did come and rescue about half of the people on the Titanic, but the ship that was close by might have really saved all of the people on the Titanic. But in any event, from then on, all ships were required to have Marconi telegraphy capability, and they were required to keep it on at all times so that it would avoid a disaster similar to the Titanic. But like many other things that Marconi did, although it was a horrendous disaster, Marconi used it in such a way to accomplish greater capability for the communications world, and it certainly advanced and helped his company as well.
Dennis, didn't they also pick a specific frequency? Pick a specific frequency based on the Titanic?
Well, in those days, they were a very broad frequency. This was the difficulty. And actually, this was a lot of the push to the chart that I showed earlier to gain much tighter allocations and much better protection so that things could operate in parallel and could operate bidirectionally as well, because at the time you could only send in one direction because of the interference that would be resident in the signal coming back the other direction.
Thanks.
One of the aspects that I found sort of interesting about the Titanic story is the initial message, the distress message that was sent out was it wasn't SOS, it was CQD, I believe. Come quick, distress, I think was what the and that was apparently the distress signal used by the Marconi operators. But then they did send out the SOS, which, yes, again, the Carpathia did receive.
I think, we looked at the demonstration. They showed the demonstration of sending Morse code over wireless link. And, we may be thinking about Morse code being antiquated and, from 100 years ago or whatever. But it's interesting that Morse code is actually still relatively widely used today. Of course, amateur radio operators still love using Morse code. A lot of them have built up incredible skills to send and receive at 30, 40, 50 words a minute, which is very fast Morse code. But also, if you're a radio scanning buff like I am, when you scan the airwaves, a lot of commercial transmitters still ID by sending their call sign out in Morse code every half hour or so. Of course, the typical user doesn't hear it. It's sort of blanked from the reception systems, so they don't have to listen to it. But if you're just scanning the airwaves, you'll hear commercial transmitters identifying themselves in Morse code every half hour or so on the air. So Morse code is still used. It's certainly not the most modern form of communication, but either for hobby or for identification purposes, it's still used. I see we have an additional question. It will take me a second to parse the question here from Colby Harper. In both popular and expert conceptions, there is a somewhat charming flavor of mystery to Marconi, Tesla, spectrum-related stuff, and their stories. Why do you think that might be, and what might be today's vestiges of that, if any? Of course, Mark alluded to that a little bit in our interview. One of the segments we didn't have time to include is I asked Mark to comment on, there were a lot of competitors to Marconi at the time. Why did Marconi succeed so well and they didn't? Of course, patents are a very big part of that. But he covers that a little bit in that interview. You may want to refer to that. But I don't know if any of the rest of our panel would like to chime in on some of their perceptions here.
I'm always happy to chime in. And a lot of my source, Marc really is a definitive source for this sort of information. So Well, I too keep his book by my side, The Person Who Networked the World. But Marconi, it was alluded to by Marc. Marconi was a rock star. He was someone who everyone wanted to be around, and he utilized that very effectively with the press, with the leaders of the world when he would come to the U.S., which he came quite frequently. I think 47 times he came to the U.S. by ship. He would meet with the President of the United States. He would meet with Thomas Edison. He would meet with the who's who in the US, the who's who in Europe, in each of the countries of Europe. And he leveraged those relationships, networking, if you will, in the human sense, to position himself very effectively to win in the competitions that existed. He was also, as is also Marc pointed out, he was a researcher. So he wasn't a salesman in the sense of selling a commodity that he didn't entirely understand or comprehend, but he was at the leading edge of doing the research to make the changes. So when you're in that position of knowing the technology and being the kind of person that he was, who was so appealing to the crowds, it was a natural formula for success for him in the business world.
Agreed. Mark Gibson, one of our attendees, has a follow-up question that Mark Raboy had mentioned, that Marconi was a tinkerer. Did he ever describe his method mathematically, or did he just experiment? My impression, again, it's unfortunate we couldn't have Mark here live. My impression, again, from reading the history is that, Marconi was a guy who had a vision, and he had an objective, and he pursued that 100% of his time. He did not appear to be one that stops and published research papers or spent a lot of time trying to describe his invention in an academic fashion. So no, I don't think he was one to sit down and do that. One of the things that struck me, on sort of opposite that, Marconi spent a lot of time sort of going in and out of, I wouldn't exactly say poverty, but all the money he had coming in from licensing and stuff, he would plow right back into the company. And if you kind of kept wondering throughout the book, like, okay, when does he finally get super rich or whatever? But every time he accumulated a lot of money, he turned around and put it right back in the company. And he had just this vision of communicating across the Atlantic and then around the world, and then providing broadcasting services for the Vatican, and all sorts of things. That his singular focus was just the development, and not really stopping to publish this in an academic manner. Yeah.
So it should be noted that he did win the Nobel Prize, the 1906 Nobel Prize, which so he was recognized, but he was clearly an experimentalist, not a theoretician.
I think it was the 1909 Nobel Prize he won.
1909, maybe I've got it the wrong date.
1909. But yes, he did win the Nobel Prize along with a Russian for the development of wireless telegraphy improvements. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Barry or Joe or Dennis, do you have anything else that you all would like to add?
Getting back to the story of the Titanic and Marconi's role, as Dennis said, Marconi was the rock star of his era. And I learned that as it happened, Marconi was in New York when the Carpathia brought the survivors, from the Titanic wreck, and he was able to meet with them, and they were, of course, very, very grateful. But if I understand correctly, it was only by happenstance that Marconi himself was not on that Titanic. So just another interesting aspect of that Titanic story.
Yep. And I do see, I didn't scroll down far enough. I do see that there was a question from Peter Cook. And he is asking, let me scroll back to find it. Questions. This is for Joe. Joe, would you not think that the iPhone and the F-35, two very different things, by the way, are cognitive radio implementations?
Yes, to some degree they are. In fact, my research for my licentiate, which is what you get in Europe before you get the PhD, described and modeled basically the iPhone. Said that if you took Wi-Fi plus 2G, you would actually beat 3G. And here's an economic and functional behavioral model of why. And sure enough, so that was in the late 90s. And then in 07, Steve Jobs came out with a Wi-Fi plus 2G in a slick package equals the iPhone, and it had a lot of computational intelligence in there. But now, was that radio smart enough to do radio things all by itself? No, it still depended on the radio network to tell it what to do. Jens Zonder was one of my advisors, and he invented radio resource management for 2G. And so it was still the network telling the radio what to do. In the future, we'll have radios that can do their own thing autonomously, but we don't quite have it now. The F-35 has lots of radio, wireless stuff, and lots of computational intelligence. And I think over the next few years, we'll have more and more OODA loops, observe, orient, decide, act, that are built in, that are computationally intelligent radios. So we're heading in that direction. As Marconi said, yes, we are heading in that direction, but I don't think we're quite there yet. Thank you.
Got it. Thanks, Joe. Very good. We do have one final question, also from Rich Lee. He wanted to know how close Marconi and Tesla were at the time. Dennis or Barry or Joe, would one of you like to take that?
How close? I'm not sure I understand the question.
How did they work together? Did they know each other well? Were they, did they get into boxing rings together?
I don't know the answer to that very well. They weren't close. They certainly weren't close. They were competitors. Yep. They certainly knew of each other. I think that Marconi was more fearful of what Tesla might do than Tesla was cognizant of the fact that Marconi was so worried about him. Tesla was a bit more of the mad scientist type and not as much the businessman as Marconi. So his work was doing ever more exciting scientific demonstrations that would propel his name forward. And yep. Certainly it's with us today, even the name of a car, some of you may have heard about. But he was in a different way a technology rock star of his era, but far more viewed as again the mad scientist, where Marconi was viewed as someone who was working feverishly to accomplish things that would better the circumstance of the world. And as Marc's book has as a subtitle, it's The Man Who Networked the World. That was his vision, his goal, to enable everyone to talk to everyone, which continues to be one of the key goals of wireless technology.
And actually, along the lines of what Dennis was just saying, what set Marconi apart from many others who were working, trying to understand what we now know as wireless technology at that time. A lot of them, as Dennis said, like Tesla, they would do interesting demonstrations. But Marconi was the one who said that let's make something truly useful out of this. And Dennis, I'm trying to remember who it was that was it Hertz or was it somebody else at that era said that I've discovered this interesting phenomenon, but there's no real practical value to it.
Right. No, in fact, it was Hertz, but there were others that had that same comment. In another forum this past Friday that Barry was in attendance at Notre Dame, celebrating the 125th anniversary of the first U.S. transmission I led a panel there and posed the question, who is the father of wireless, and suggested 25 or so individuals who had contributed to the stream of what became the first demonstration, and even Marconi's demonstration that we heard so much about here was paralleled by Jagdish Bose and by Popov in Russia. And each claimed, well, particularly Popov, that they were really the first one to do long distance wireless transmission. But the point was that there were lots of people who were working in this space at that time. But as Barry has suggested, they were working in an academic fashion. Some of them were writing papers, as was the question earlier. And that was not Marconi at all. Marconi's goal was, this is a means to an end. This is not the end in itself. And that's what sets him apart. And that's why we recognize him as the father of wireless. Whether he was really the first one to do the long distance demonstration or not is to a large degree irrelevant, because he ran with the ball, had the vision of what to do with it, didn't view it as a laboratory curiosity or something that he could gain oohs and ahs of the crowd by demonstrating. It was this means to an ultimate end that had great benefit to the world. And that's really the significance of Marconi in my mind.
And maybe Tesla got the last laugh, because if you get in a Tesla car today, it generates so much RFI you can't listen to the AM radio. So anyway, all right. On that note, I don't see any other questions. I appreciate all of our panelists, Barry, Dennis, Joe, Julia in absentia, thank you, and especially Marc Raboy for his fascinating interview. Thanks to all of you. And like we said earlier, this will be on our YouTube channel for those who weren't able to join live, or anybody who wants to rewatch it. And maybe we'll be back here in 50 years to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the birth of Marconi, or somebody will. And we look forward to that. Thanks, everybody.
I look forward to being part of that panel. That should be great.
All right. Very good.
I'll be around in 50 years, but
yeah, great. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye now.
Thank you all. Bye now.